Welcome to Balcony Views with BJ. Now this is not our normal balcony view. We're normally on a ship, but this one is brought to you from beautiful Hawaii. Aloha! Yeah, we're at the Twin Fin Hotel across the street from world famous Waikiki Beach in Honolulu, Hawaii. Now, the reason I'm doing it from here is I just took a cruise. I had some days in Australia. It was an awesome Trans-Pacific cruise. I'm probably going to do a video on it a little later, but I wanted to touch on an actually very serious situation that occurred on the ship that I thought a lot of you guys might be interested to know, and that is what it's like to have COVID on a Royal Caribbean ship right now. Now, right now is November of 2022. So on our ship, it was a Trans-Pacific cruise from Hawaii to Brisbane, Australia. We had 18 nights. It was glorious. Trust me, if you ever get the chance, please do it. It is unlike any other cruise, honestly. It was just a great experience, but we'll go beyond that. During that cruise, fairly early on, quite a few people got COVID. Now, there's a lot of miscommunication and honestly non-communication from Royal Caribbean on that part as to how many actually had COVID. Now, the people that were in quarantine with COVID, many of them said that it was 200, 300. There was I believe it was a report, we've heard there was a report on Australian TV that it was over 400. Now, I don't actually believe it was that many. What I'm getting from the people that were in quarantine was one person, and hold on, let me specify something. All the information that I'm giving to you came directly from people in COVID. Now, I, thank goodness, did not have COVID and was not quarantined. So this is not my information, but this did come directly from those that were in quarantine because they did test positive for COVID on our ship, Quantum of the Seas, and they were put in quarantine, many of them at the same time, and they posted on Facebook a lot of posts about their experiences. I am relaying that information to you. So if you want to know what it's like there, we had a ton of people posting on Facebook, on our Facebook group, specifically for that sailing. So most of this information, no, all of this information comes from them. And they are to be credited for keeping those of us who were not in quarantine updated. It did not sound like a good situation, to be honest about it. Now, I know they blame Royal. I don't say Royal is blameless, but I'm not going to say that they're entirely at fault for the way some things went down. In the end, I think they did try to do their very, very best, with exception of some execution. At any rate, so many of the people that were in quarantine were stating information, and that's what I'm bringing to you today. First thing I want to talk about is something I did not know about. When you test positive on a Royal Caribbean ship, then you are actually moved from your cabin to a quarantine floor or area. Now, I always thought you were quarantined in your room. That's what I expected. That's why most of the time I do my best to get a balcony room. And I would think that would be the best situation because you would have some fresh air, outside time. Unfortunately, that is not what happens. For our group anyway, they were all quarantined on the third deck, which doesn't have balconies. They did have a view. They had an ocean view, little porthole, I guess, down on the third floor. I would think there wouldn't be a whole lot much more than that. So that was something I thought was kind of interesting, and one of the main reasons I wanted to do this video, because if you didn't know that, that could be pretty shocking. I know I would have been extremely disappointed to be moved from my 8th floor balcony room to a 3rd floor ocean view, especially with all the other things that goes along with that quarantine. Right now, as we talk, or as I talk, in November of 2022, the quarantine consists of being put in that quarantine floor. Now, Royal Caribbean said that they wanted to put them on the 3rd floor because it got them closer to the medic. I'm not so sure I believe that, but okay, fine, sure, whatever. If that's what they want to say, and it does do that. It puts them close to the medics. So okay, great. But if that's truly what their purpose is, that's probably not a bad thing, as long as the medical department is doing its due diligence for those people staying there. And it kind of didn't really sound like they were from the majority of those who posted on the Facebook group. Now, again, those posted on the Facebook were probably not a majority, if the numbers are correct. There was probably somewhere around 12 to 15 that I actually saw in the early parts that were posting on Facebook. Now, one thing the Royal Caribbean definitely does right is when they quarantine you, you get a lot of, or you're supposed to get a lot of options there. One is they give you the fast streaming internet, which as of right now, because they still do not have Starlink or whatever the new one is from Elon Musk, they don't have that on all the ships yet. So because of that, it's still not great. But if they get that on there and it is as quick and fast as we think it's going to be, that's really going to be a good thing. And that's nice, whether you've paid for it or not. As long as you're in quarantine, you have full access to that. So that's a good thing. You also get room service. Duh. You can't leave your room. And right now it's for 5 days. When we initially left, now that's where some things got a little crazy. When we left, it was supposed to be 5 days. They tested on the 5th day. I think it was actually the 5th and 6th. And then it changed during our sailing. Now, as I understand it, part of the reason it changed was because of the destinations and the waters we were in. When the first group, and I'll call them groups, when the first group was tested positive for COVID, it was pretty early on, like day 3 or 4 of the cruise. And this cruise was, as I said, was an 18-night. We didn't have any ports until day 7. Day 7, we docked in Tahiti, and we had 4 nights, or 4 days, back to back in Tahiti, Moorea. We had an overnight in Moorea, and then Raiatea, I think is how you pronounce the island that we were in. The group that was first quarantined had to miss all of those islands, unfortunately, and I hate it for them. They were great islands, and it was definitely a bad situation for them. In the end, I understand that, and I think they did too. It might have been disappointing, but I think they understood, hey, I've got COVID, I need to be quarantined. As much as this stinks, hey, I'm still on a cruise, and I'm going to try to enjoy it as much as I can. The majority of the complaints that I read on our Facebook group was about that room service. One, a lot of them had the drink package. Due to that, they were told that they could continue to enjoy that drink package while in their rooms. They just had to order it through room service. There was some iffy things going on there about that. Some people they would contact would say they weren't allowed to have alcohol. That was the medical team had decided they couldn't have alcohol. Well, I don't know how that makes a difference. You've got COVID, not cirrhosis of the liver. I don't know why the alcohol has anything to do there? That just really doesn't make sense to me. Many of them were stating that they felt like it was maybe the room service people kind of trying to pass the buck because it was a little bit too much for them. And that is very possible. At one point during this time, one of the people posted that they had talked to an officer and they were discussing about the numbers of COVID cases. He wouldn't confirm a number, but the gentleman did say that he thought that there were over 300 to the officer, and he said no, there was not 300. At then he said, well, I'm sure it's at least 200, and he said he didn't get a response from that. That led him to believe that somewhere between 200 and 300 was the actual number of COVID cases in quarantine at that time. He can't verify that. I can't verify that. But that does sound logical. If you had 200 cases in quarantine and room service is trying to provide them around the clock room service as well as bar service, that's a lot. So I can understand how they could be overwhelmed. With that in mind, the room service and bar service for those people that were in quarantine did not seem to be up to par. Many people were saying that they weren't getting meals on time. Many of them said they didn't get meals at all. One person said they were in quarantine for a full day and didn't get any meals. And then they brought all 3 of their meals the next day. I don't know where to go with that. I mean, if that is really true, that's really sad. And I feel sorry for that person. But quarantine on Royal Caribbean ship is definitely not what I thought it would be. If all of this that I was relayed through Facebook occurred. Yes, I would be upset being put in a different room that was not equivalent to what I was in. If room service wasn't up to par, I mean, at least I get room service. That's great. I mean, of course, they've got to feed you. But, and yes, if you paid for the ultimate drink package, I would think that you would expect to have drinks when you want them. But now let's talk about the brighter side. Well, I won't say brighter side. Let's talk about the little bit better side of what Royal Caribbean did for the people that were in quarantine. Yes, being in quarantine is definitely not a fun thing, I'm sure. But here's what Royal Caribbean told everyone they were doing for those in quarantine. For one, every day they spent in quarantine, they got prorated part of their cruise return. As I recall, I'm pretty sure they said they were going to give them a refund for those days as well for every package and everything that they were eating. So if they had bought the ultimate dining package, they get a refund for that. If they bought the ultimate drink package, even though they were getting their drinks in their room, they would still get a refund for that day for the ultimate drink package. Obviously, the islands they missed, they would get a refund for any excursions that they had done. I think that's pretty, I think it's necessary, but I think that's a pretty good way of doing it for Royal Caribbean. Also, now I may have misread this one, but I read it several times to try to make sure I understood what they were saying was correct. It sounded like if you came down with COVID on day 4, you got credited for the whole rest of the cruise. Now, I'm not positive about that, but one thing that I read definitely sounded like they were going to give them credit for the whole rest of the cruise. Now, this was later on, and I think it was in response to the fact that once you finally got out of COVID quarantine, you had to wear a mask the entire rest of the cruise, everywhere you went, except for when you were eating. There were some specific rules for those who had gotten out of COVID, as they said on the Facebook, gotten out of jail, and there were some guidelines that they had to follow after that fact. Which, I mean, I guess that makes sense. That's taking care of the other people on the cruise, the other sailors or cruisers. So it's definitely a good thing, but I can understand why it would be inconvenient, and why, because of that, Royal Caribbean would compensate them by returning those funds, because they weren't able to fully experience that cruise that they had signed up for. Another thing they were doing is they were giving them additional future cruise credit. Now, some of them kind of balked about this. I don't really understand that. They're getting refunded for the majority of their cruise, and then they're getting future cruise credit. Well, they didn't want future cruise credit. At least some of them didn't. I don't understand that. I mean, unless you're just simply outdone with Royal Caribbean because of that, and Royal Caribbean didn't give you COVID. It's not their fault you got it. So I don't understand that. I would have been very happy with getting extra future cruise credit. I don't remember exactly what the amount was, but there was definitely a additional compensation from having tested positive for COVID for that. So, you know, that's a lot of information there. And it's definitely not a situation you want to be in. But if you're on a Royal Caribbean cruise in the near future, because guess what? All of this can change tomorrow. So who knows what the things are going to be on a different ship, in a different month. It's going to be all over the place. But right now, as of right now, in November of 2022, that's kind of what it's like to have COVID on a cruise ship. I don't think it would be fun, but it definitely sounds to me like Royal is doing everything they can. You've got to give them credit. I'm sure they didn't expect 200 cases of COVID all at the same time. So I can understand why staffing was a little bit short on that, and why maybe it was a little more difficult for them to do what they needed to do in that quarantine. But I also understand the people that were on the Facebook page and were complaining about it, because you know what? They probably should have planned for it in some way. So either way, information for you. I just want to make sure that you had at least an idea, because there's some of those things that I never even would have expected. And here's something else I didn't expect. Sorry, the camera kind of cut out on me, and I didn't know it until I was putting the video together. So I apologize for that. I also want to apologize because it has been a little over 2 months since I did the original video, and I wanted to make sure I had everything together. I actually had some friends who went on a cruise on the same ship out of Australia right before Christmas, and they gave me some great information. Scott, Michelle, I want to thank you for that, and allowing me to give your information to everybody as well. What they said is Australia's rules now are a little different than most. They require all sailings to be 0 cases before they leave, which, I mean, that makes sense to a lot of people, but you know, everybody gets tested before the cruise. But that also includes back-to-backers, and they happen to be doing a back-to-back-to-back cruise, so they were on 3 consecutive cruises. I'm not sure how long the first cruise was, where one of them got sick, and the next one was supposed to be a 9-night, I believe, and then they had another one after that. So they got sick. I think it was Michelle I know it was Michelle who got sick on the last day of the cruise, I believe, or maybe the day before that. So they were offered the opportunity to quarantine either in their room together. They both had to quarantine, or Michelle could go to the 3rd floor, as I told you earlier was the case on our Trans-Pacific cruise. They chose to quarantine in their room. They said all the amenities were, you got, the internet was opened up for you for free. All the movies on the TV were free. Food was brought to the room. They said the food was spectacular, even brought to the room. And they said they had great service. So I would say all the service issues that were on our sailing have been rectified. Plus, they probably don't have nearly the number. And to support that, they said that when the sailing was over, that sailing, all of the higher staff was more than happy to allow them to stay on the ship and finish out their quarantine, which was just a few more days, and then continue on with their normal cruise. However, the Australian government would not allow that, so they, along with a few other, I think they said around 20 people, were escorted off of the ship through the, I guess, the employee exit. He said the tradesman's exit area, and they had to pick up their stuff there. My friends decided to stay in Sydney. This was in Sydney. They decided to stay in Sydney for that time until their next cruise, which was to leave out of Sydney, I believe. It might have been Brisbane. Either way, it doesn't matter. Other than having to miss out on the cruise, they felt like they were treated very well. And so that's how that part goes. I would say that the biggest thing is not everything is going to be the same no matter where. I mean, it's going to be the same in Australia for Royal. It's going to be the same in other places, but those are not always going to correspond. Royal Caribbean in the Caribbean may be completely different than what my friends are experiencing in Australia. It may be different in Europe. So you never know. There's no steadfast rule, I don't believe. But that's kind of what it's like right now, cruising on Royal Caribbean, at least, with COVID. So take all of that with a grain of salt. And in the end, I'm BJ, and those are, or at least were, my balcony views. I hope you enjoy your next cruise.